He controlled the city. He controlled the courts. He was untouchable. But in the span of one ruthless week, all of Salvatore, the Iron Rossi's billions were gone, vanished. Because of a simple, fatal flaw in his own bookkeeping. A flaw no one in his entire empire saw. But the one person who spotted the numbers was serving him coffee. Salvatore Rossi wasn't merely a boss, he was the architect of a silent, sprawling nation built on concrete, contracts, and fear. His money didn't sit in bank accounts, it flowed, a dark river powering half the legitimate construction projects in the city, financing the shadow deals that kept the city's nightlife humming. Visually, his power was undeniable. We're talking about the private jet that could be summoned from a hangar at a moment's notice, the glass-walled mansion perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, where every marble tile had been personally approved by him. This was a man who handled billions without ever looking at a balance sheet. That task was relegated to a rotating stable of trembling accountants who knew a misplaced comma could cost them more than their careers. Rossi's ruthlessness was the true currency of his empire. He never yelled. He simply looked. And when he looked, the silent contract was sealed. I give you everything, but you take nothing. His business deals were legendary, executed with the cold efficiency of a surgeon. A rival company would suddenly fold, their assets effortlessly transferred to a shell corporation controlled by Rossi. A politician would shift their vote overnight after a quiet dinner at his exclusive club. For 20 years, Salvatore's success had been predicated on the impossibility of his failure. The money was too vast, the influence too deep, the control too absolute. Bankruptcy was a fairy tale told to children, it simply did not happen to the Iron. Yet, this absolute confidence, this unquestioning belief in the impervious nature of his reign, was precisely what made him blind. It made him ignore the meticulous, almost invisible details that only someone with no stake, no fear, and nothing to lose could ever hope to see. And those details, buried deep beneath the mountains of his gold, had been slowly, silently poisoning the foundation of his throne for years. For a man who rarely looked at a screen, the subtle shift in atmosphere was his only warning. It began not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a nervous cough. For months, Salvatore had been attending routine meetings, only to find his lead accountant, Mr. Gallo, perpetually sweating through his tailored shirt. Gallo would never name the problem directly. He spoke in vague terms about market corrections and unforeseen liquidity adjustments. But the look in his eyes, the kind of terror reserved for men who knew they stood on a trapdoor, spoke volumes. The initial signs were easy to dismiss as market fluctuations. A major overseas transfer meant to yield $20 million mysteriously returned $5 million less. A massive urban development project, usually a guaranteed golden goose, posted an alarming, unexplained drop in rental revenue. When the bank finally got involved, their tone was professionally clipped, not subservient. A senior partner, usually deferential to the point of bowing, delivered a discreet warning over a secure line. Salvatore, a number of your holding companies are showing unusual, persistent drains. They are small, but they are everywhere. Rossi's mind, accustomed to fighting armies, struggled to grapple with a silent, unseen infection. He ordered inquiries, threats, and audits, but all led back to dead ends, perfectly reconciled ledgers, and accountants too terrified to lie, yet unable to explain the numbers. The strange part was the scale. The money disappearing wasn't a massive sum that would trigger an alarm, but a series of continuous, mid-level losses. It was like a giant vault, impervious to explosives, now bleeding out through 100 hairline cracks. The tension in the empire became a tangible weight. Associates were suddenly unsure of their footing. Rossi's own sleep grew restless, plagued by the knowledge that something was fundamentally wrong, yet invisible. He still had billions. But for the first time in 20 years, Salvatore, the Iron Rossi felt the chill of uncertainty, a terrifying, slow realization that his impenetrable kingdom was hemorrhaging, and every solution he tried only proved how utterly blind he was to the real enemy. The venue for Salvatore Rossi's most critical meetings was always the penthouse dining room of the Sterling, a restaurant so exclusive the menu was whispered, not printed. It was a sterile, silent temple of transactions, and the only person in the room who truly saw everything was the one whose job it was to be invisible, the waitress. Her name was Lena. Lena existed on the periphery, moving through the tension like a ghost. Her uniform, crisp white shirt, severe black apron, was a camouflage, an enforced invisibility that she used with surgical precision. She knew the power dynamics by the angle of a shoulder, the moment a deal was closed by the lack of eye contact. Her value wasn't just in her efficiency, it was in her silence and her observant mind. While the city's most powerful men obsessed over the large figures and the terms of power, Lena watched the forgotten details. She noticed the nervous tick in the accountant's cheek, the unusual frequency of Salvatore's visits, and the fact that a man who drank vintage scotch now ordered nothing but black coffee, and never finished it. On this particular night, the air in the penthouse was thick with a specific, acidic frustration. Salvatore Rossi had spent 3 hours with his legal team, staring across the polished mahogany at a series of documents detailing his financial hemorrhaging. The discussion was heated, but abstract. As Lena approached the table to remove the empty coffee cups, Rossi, in a moment of pure, blinding fury, swept his arm across the desk, sending a half-full cup of black coffee tumbling. It splattered across a printed financial projection before dripping onto the marble floor. "Clean up that coffee stain," Rossi commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Lena's face remained neutral, her eyes focused only on the stain. But as she knelt, dabbing the dark liquid from the expensive paper, her mind, trained by hours of studying for her finance degree at night, registered something else entirely. The coffee stain had perfectly smeared one tiny, handwritten correction on the projection, a minuscule, yet critical, reference to a subsidiary acquisition that seemed fundamentally out of place with the document's overall grim assessment. It was a detail so small, so utterly beneath the notice of the powerful men arguing over billions, yet Lena's focus had snagged on it. For the first time, she felt a flicker of understanding, a quiet certainty that the problem was not global market trends, but a calculation error the boss himself had dismissed as mere spillage. The fatal flaw wasn't a sophisticated hack or a calculated betrayal, it was born of Salvatore's greatest weakness, his contempt for the minuscule. His vast empire had been maintained through dozens of complex, interlocking contracts, but the oversight that began the collapse was a single, innocuous piece of paper related to the sale of a key port property 3 months prior. Rossi, confident in the sheer weight of his organization and weary of the tedious legal jargon, had waved off a final review. The document in question was a standard asset transfer agreement, hundreds of pages long. Deep within the boilerplate, in an addendum filed on a Friday afternoon, was a clause detailing a right of first refusal on an adjacent warehouse lot. The key, however, was a simple error in the specified currency. Instead of denoting the sale price in US dollars, $/math/$dollar, a dollar, the addendum's payment clause referenced a minor holding company's internal ledger, denominated in a much weaker foreign currency, effectively slashing the minimum purchase price by 40%. His accountants, focused on the main transaction's 9-figure revenue, had dismissed the addendum as a trivial formality concerning an unused parcel of land. They saw the overall profit and assured Salvatore the deal was secure. But the rival entity, sharp and vulture-like, had spotted the loophole. They didn't need a genius, they just needed a lawyer who could read the fine print that Salvatore had signed off on in a hurry. That oversight granted the rival the right to purchase the warehouse, a critical staging area for Rossi's entire import network, at a fraction of its value, effectively crippling his operation. When the rival triggered the clause, legally and irrevocably, the dominoes began to fall. The initial cost was a manageable $30 million, but the consequential loss of the warehouse choked his supply lines, triggered penalty clauses in his other contracts, and destroyed his market credibility. The panic had a source, and it was humiliatingly simple. Salvatore Rossi had been bankrupted by a typographical error he'd been too arrogant to spot, all contained within the single document that was now spread across his boardroom table, momentarily stained with his own cold coffee. The chaos that followed the coffee incident escalated rapidly. Salvatore Rossi, having confirmed the irreversible damage caused by the currency error, spent the next hour in a controlled, terrifying rage. He wasn't yelling, he was dismantling. He systematically ripped up every piece of extraneous paper on the desk, documents that had suddenly become useless relics of his former confidence. He tore the original addendum to shreds and crumpled a sheaf of recent bank activity reports into a tight, hard ball of frustrated currency. With a guttural sound of pure defeat, he flung the paper ball toward the distant window. It missed the window, bouncing off the rich velvet drapery, and landed with a soft thud near the service cart where Lena was meticulously polishing a water glass. This was her third circuit of the room, her presence a silent, rhythmic counterpoint to the men's despair. This time, however, she couldn't simply ignore the crumpled paper. It was too close to her workspace. As she reached down with her cleaning rag to sweep it away, the paper ball partially unfurled. Lena's eye, trained over countless late nights studying finance textbooks, caught a single, dark-inked date and a corresponding reference number on the corner of what was clearly a recent receipt for a massive, but ultimately routine, payment. It was the date of the rival's final acquisition of the disputed warehouse. Normally, this number would mean nothing, but Lena had a sharp, civic memory. Just last week, while riding the subway home, she had scanned a large, digital headline that scrolled across the news ticker. The headline detailed the rival company's initial press release about the purchase, proudly announcing the acquisition was finalized 3 days later than the date printed on Rossi's receipt. The difference was small, just 72 hours. But in the world of high finance and contractual law, 3 days was an eternity. A receipt for a payment made after the publicized finalization date meant something was fundamentally misdated, perhaps intentionally, perhaps accidentally. For Salvatore's team, buried under a mountain of billion-dollar losses, a 3-day discrepancy on a receipt was meaningless noise. But for Lena, it was the first, quiet click of the tumblers falling into place. It wasn't the currency error that had ultimately sealed his fate, it was the date of the execution. The fatal mistake might not have been in the contract at all, but in the time stamp. She discreetly palmed the crumpled receipt, her heart pounding a quiet, nervous rhythm beneath her crisp white shirt. For the first time, she had proof that the men who ruled the city were wrong. The crumpled paper felt impossibly heavy in Lena's hand, a tiny piece of evidence against a criminal enterprise. She finished her shift in a focused blur, her mind no longer on spilled coffee or demanding patrons, but on the potential contradiction buried in Salvatore Rossi's receipt. The date discrepancy, a mere 3 days between the rival's public announcement and Rossi's internal payment document, was a thread too thin for a high-powered law firm to pull, but for Lena, it was everything. Once home, nestled in the small apartment she shared with a roommate, Lena spread the fragile, coffee-stained paper under the beam of her desk lamp. She went online, not to the dark web, but to the public, mundane archives of the city's property transfer records and business news tickers. She cross-referenced the receipt's reference number against the public filing date of the rival acquisition. The numbers refused to align. The rival corporation had publicly and legally finalized the transfer on a Tuesday morning. The receipt showed Rossi's payment was accounted for on the following Friday. The gap wasn't a typo, it was a window. A 3-day period where the legal paperwork was completed, but the payment had stalled. Why? Rossi's team had dismissed the delay as mere bureaucratic lag time. But Lena's intuition, sharpened by her studies in corporate finance, screamed something else. If the payment was late, that single currency error, the one that slashed the price by 40%, might have been rectifiable. If the payment window had closed before Rossi's final, erroneous wire went through, the rival had likely closed the deal prematurely, leaving them vulnerable to a cancellation or even a lawsuit. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. The boss hadn't been defeated by the mistake, he'd been defeated by the timing of his payment following the mistake. His own massive financial delay, likely caused by internal oversight and arrogance, was the final pin in the grenade. Now, Lena faced a brutal choice. She had evidence that could potentially save the mafia boss's empire from total collapse and possibly expose the rival company to a costly legal battle. To act was to step directly into the crosshairs of the city's most ruthless man and his enemies. To do nothing was to let arrogance destroy a billion-dollar legacy over a few lost days. The risk was monumental, but the numbers were clear. She knew the secret. The only question left was how to tell the iron. The next day, Salvatore Rossi was not in his penthouse boardroom. He was holding court in a private, heavily guarded back room of an old cigar club, a sign that his empire was already retreating into the shadows. The atmosphere was one of profound, dangerous frustration. Guards stood rigid, their eyes constantly sweeping the room. The air was thick with smoke and the silent expectation of catastrophe. Lena, assigned to the club for the day, moved slower than usual, every muscle coiled with fear. She carried the crumpled receipt, now smoothed out and folded precisely, taped to the inside of her apron pocket. She had to get close. She had to break the invisible barrier of deference and terror that insulated Rossi from reality. She watched as he ended a furious call, slamming the heavy receiver down with a crash that startled everyone. Rossi was red-faced, rising from his chair, a raw manifestation of the rage of a billionaire who had lost everything. This was her only chance. Ignoring the protocol, ignoring the glare of the guards who took an aggressive step toward her, Lena moved. She placed a glass of water down near his hand, then quickly, firmly, reached into her apron and slapped the smoothed-out receipt directly onto the table, covering a legal pad he was about to deface with angry scribbles. Rossi's attention snapped from his despair to her. His eyes, usually cold, were suddenly burning with lethal intent. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that froze the blood in the guards. It was the moment captured in the thumbnail, the boss enraged, the waitress reaching forward. "The date, Mr. Rossi," Lena whispered, leaning in, her voice tremulous but firm. She pointed a steady finger directly at the paper. "Your payment was accounted for on Friday. The rival's public finalized acquisition was Tuesday. There's a 72-hour window. The money was late. The deal may be voidable." For a full, agonizing second, Salvatore did not move. His massive hand, which moments before had been ready to crush the desk, hovered above the receipt. He looked not at the paper, but straight into Lena's eyes, searching for a single flicker of deception or madness. She held his gaze, her entire future balanced on the truth of that single, coffee-stained date. She had risked everything to show him that his biggest war could be won by correcting the smallest oversight. The silence that followed Lena's revelation was the most profound sound in the cigar club. Salvatore Rossi, frozen by the truth in her eyes, slowly lowered his hand. He didn't snatch the paper, he let his gaze drop, absorbing the date on the faded, coffee-stained corner. He looked at the receipt for 5 seconds, 5 seconds that erased months of panic and billions of lost revenue. When he finally spoke, his voice was utterly different. The raw, panicked rage was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. "Gallo," he rasped, summoning his quivering head accountant, who stumbled forward from the shadows. "Call legal. Tell them to cross-reference the public record of the port sale. Tuesday morning. Check the wire transfer log. Friday afternoon." Rossi didn't wait for confirmation. His mind was already miles ahead, running the calculations Lena had provided. The late payment, the 3-day gap, it was the legal hook he needed to declare the rival's acquisition invalid based on a failure to meet the contractual funding timeline. The initial currency error, the devastating flaw he'd been focused on, was irrelevant. The true fatal mistake was the simple oversight in timing, which his own panic-blinded team had overlooked entirely. Salvatore Rossi didn't feel relief, nor did he feel gratitude. He felt the cold, hard validation of his own existence. He had almost been undone by the stupidity of those around him, saved only by a waitress who possessed the clarity he'd paid his entire empire to find. The reversal was instantaneous. The furious energy that had been dismantling his life was now channeled into furious action. "Legal fights start now," he announced to the room, not a boss, but a general commanding a renewed offensive. "The bank warnings stop. We are solvent." The guards stood taller, the accountant began frantically dialing. In one breath, the empire was saved, not by muscle or genius, but by an honest reading of a receipt. Salvatore looked at Lena one last time, a clinical, calculating assessment. "You saved me, he stated, not as a thank you, but as a realization of a new, unsettling debt. Then, without another word, he turned his full attention to the recovered kingdom. Lena's part was done, but the question of her future, and the cost of her intervention, now hung heavily in the air. The legal battle that followed Lena's revelation was swift, brutal, and entirely successful. Armed with the irrefutable evidence of the late transfer, Salvatore Rossi's lawyers invalidated the port's sale, recovering the crucial assets and stabilizing the crumbling empire within a month. The rival company was humiliated and financially wounded. The Iron was back on his throne, more formidable and cautious than before. The question everyone, from the terrified accountants to the now-relieved legal team, asked was simple: what happened to the girl? Rossi understood debt, and he understood utility. He didn't reward Lena with a vast sum of cash or a public commendation that would draw too much attention to his vulnerability. Instead, he made her disappear. Not violently, but completely. 2 days after the confrontation, Lena was approached with a non-negotiable offer: a fully funded scholarship to the best business school she could get into, anywhere in the country, plus a comfortable, anonymous trust fund sufficient for her education and expenses. The condition was permanent: absolute silence. She was never to work in the Sterling again. She was never to speak Rossi's name or the word receipt to a soul. Lena took the deal. She took the quiet redemption. She traded her white apron for a seat in a lecture hall, her keen eye for detail now applied to financial modeling instead of coffee stains. She had saved the boss, not for morality, but for the clarity of the numbers, and the reward was a freedom she could never have earned otherwise. Salvatore Rossi returned to his penthouse, the incident a cold lesson in the dangers of complexity. He still commanded billions, but he never again dismissed a detail, no matter how small, and he forever eliminated all corporate meetings at the Sterling. He understood that his near-bankrupt fate had not been decided by his rivals or his enemies, but by the one thing he never valued: the meticulous focus of a black waitress whose poverty afforded her a clarity the arrogance of his wealth had denied him. And that, in the ruthless world of power, was the most profound and expensive lesson of all. If this story proves anything, it's that the biggest risks often hide in the smallest details, and true power can come from the most unexpected places. We want to know, if you were Lena, knowing the danger of dealing with the Iron Rossi, would you have risked your life to reveal the fatal mistake? Let us know your answer in the comments below. If you enjoy these deep dives into the secret histories and dramatic downfalls of the ultra-rich, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story.